When we look at another person, do we really know what they are thinking? We think we know people sometimes really very good, but to be quite truthful, it is very hard to understand anything anybody is thinking all the time. For many people, it is even impossible to realize what they're thinking themselves. So when they have to go to court for maybe a crime they committed or something that they did that was by somebody seen as wrong, and they had to pay for that by visiting the court, they very often they don't even realize that there is something wrong. There's no sense of guilt, and then they say, "Oh, you're a sociopath or you're a psychopath or something like this," because you don't have any feelings for that. But the reality is that knowing something already is very difficult. And I don't want to go too philosophical at this moment, but I want to talk with you about something that is very dear to my heart, namely how to understand other people. That's one thing, very important. I do diagnosis in Chinese medicine very often, and we have all kinds of tools in the way how we treat people and how then we diagnose. And we do special trainings as a daoist medicine practitioner to be able to understand how a human being works. But it very easily, as a sort of a refuge, becomes something materialist, while there's so much to know about the person. So in the Huangdi Jing it says, if you don't have a personal relationship with your therapist, then you never will be able to heal that person. And in the modern times, people are not supposed to have a personal relationship with their clients. You are supposed to be at a distance because everything has to be scientific proven. It means that the personal should not be mattering. You should not mind the personal. I teach Chinese medicine. I practice Chinese medicine. I practice Taoism and I teach Taoism. I teach all kinds of things that swing in between, and I try to help people to try to understand, of course, as a result, that what this Taoism is all about. You will see later on in the video some part of a class that I recently gave. But when I talk about Taoism, sometimes people say but this is not what everybody else says. And what is the reason for that? So I think it is time that I explain a little bit about it. And in the meantime, while I do that, I also illustrate a little bit about my translation project, the Daoist translation project. If you like the translation project that I'm busy with and you understand my motivation, then please feel free to join the Patreon and to support it, or follow the link below that is going to help you towards the program for the translations, so that you can sign up directly for the translation and say but I also want to read something from these translations. You will support me tremendously so that I can spend more time on the translating. Where did I get my ideas from, and where do other people get their ideas from? So this is basically what we are going to discuss today. You have to understand, from the beginning of my life, besides having health issues, I was always very creative and I tried to become an artist. I was very impressed by artworks, even though in my family nobody ever went to the museum, nobody ever read a book or anything. Well, not completely, but they were not really big fans of it. I was, as you see, a little bit of a bibliophile already from childhood. And I still have a lot of books that I collected in my teenage years because I can't say goodbye to them. It is part of my work now. So if I don't have these books, I can't do my work very well. So if you want to hurt me, you burn my books.
Don't do that. Don't do that. Because I really need my books.
When I started studying Chinese medicine, Qigong, meditation and so on, every time when I practiced as a Westerner, being educated in the West, I realized there's something off with what I learned. There are several things that put me on the track that I am right now, and through which I can see when other people are on that same track or are in the stage before where they don't notice yet that something is really off. And I'm going to talk with you about these things. You want to know about that? Then just stay in the video. If you don't want to know about it, then this is the time when you can hang up and say okay, let's go watch something else. Part of my bachelor, master and PhD studies was a study of anthropology, and I can't say that I went through an anthropology course because the university was too open in structure to be able to give structural anthropology course, but there was a lot of anthropology study in it, and this was also partly my own research and activities that draw me deeper into that. And one of the things that is problematic with anthropology, as you probably know, is that it is a result of our colonial times. What they did is they were looking at other cultures and make notes about other ethnicities, about other cultures, and they compared that with our culture. And that is, although to a large degree recognized nowadays as being problematic and not exactly like that, but a lot of our knowledge about other cultures is still reverberating that colonial time. You can say that nowadays, because of our exposure to other cultures, everybody in a way is a little bit like a 19th century anthropologist, because we see a little bit about this tribal people and we see a little bit about that tribal people and a little bit about that, and we hear people comment about it and we see it continuously compared with the things that we know from our culture. As a result of that perspective, we see that the other cultures, there are many similarities with our own culture. So we think that is normal. And as a result of that, we develop what is called a universalist worldview. And that means that we recognize in the other culture what we already know. And we basically block out the things that we don't know, that we don't understand, because we're happy with that what we found, that is what we know. Understanding things is the same like how the internet works. You
swipe left or you
swipe right and you see something that hits inside your head and you get like a chemical reward and you go like, oh yeah, this is what I like, this is what I want. And the algorithm behind it tries to make sure that you see that what you want. Your brain works like that. When it gets a reward for recognition, it is like that. It is similar like that also on the emotional level. Some people, they like to be liked, and every time when somebody likes them, they are like, oh yeah. And some people, they just like to be not liked. So when somebody dislikes them, they go like, oh yeah. And even though they suffer, they go cry, nobody likes me. And there is this reward system in us that when we are not liked, that we actually like that. So whatever we are used to, you can say, we start liking. It's a difficult thing. You have to understand this is a very difficult thing. And understanding other cultures are based on that same kind of view. Other cultures understand each other on that kind of universalist basis. If the Chinese look at us, they do that on a universalist basis based on the assumptions within their culture. If the Africans do that about the Europeans, or the Europeans do that about the Africans, or we do that from the Europeans to the Americans even, we do that on the same universalist values. It is only when you come in closer contact with each other that you start noticing that it is not right. Yeah, it doesn't fit. It doesn't compute. It doesn't do the things that it's supposed to do. And in the translation of Chinese language, you can say, okay, if I take a superficial view, like in a newspaper, things are easy. When I take things from our universalist perspective, yes, things are still pretty much easy. They are complicated because the words are complicated, but they are understandable because I understand them from the perspective of my culture. But at the moment when you try to understand things from the other culture, that means you really have to use this trick that anthropology uses. What is really valuable about anthropology is to immerse yourself in that other culture. At the moment when you immerse yourself in that other culture, it's not just wearing the suit, right? It is actually learning to think within the frame of that culture. So there's something about the language and about the habits, the way how the facial expression works, about how the body expression works, how they walk, how they sleep, all these kind of things, how they eat also. All these kind of things, they're all part of the minute details that make up a culture. And you have to become a culturalist. When you do that, you learn two things. Namely, you learn things about your culture and you learn things about the other culture. If you are lazy, you only recognize what you already know. And you see some things like, oh, they're done different, but they have the same value. But at the moment when you look deeper, you can very often see that the values actually are very different. Confucianism, for instance, has an idea about human rights, where you have to earn your right to be a human. If you are not behaving like a human, you're a criminal, or you're beating up your wife or your husband or your children. If you are stealing or you're taking drugs, you're a junkie, maybe. Yes, in that case, within the Chinese culture, you are not behaving like a human. So you do not take responsibility for trying to be the best that you can be. You try not to be a human. So you gamble away your human rights at the moment when you trespass on the territory where you're not supposed to be. Well, in the West, you are a human right because you have 2 arms and hands, and you have 2 legs, and you have a head. That is very different. You know? The fact that you talk and the fact that you think and that you have feelings doesn't make you a human necessarily in that perspective. It actually means that if you have the right moral compass, then at that moment you are humane, and as a result of that, you are more human. One day I was in a train going from Wuhan to another city. I forget which city it was. I was there with a friend of mine. He was a translator for the Chinese government. He was on his way with me to a conference for translators, and we talked. The train ride was about 12 hours or so, slow train, and we had a lot of time to talk. And we talked about the translation task. And he said, like, well, you know, when I translate, I usually translate in the name of the Chinese government. The Chinese government gives me an assignment to translate something, and they point out a book that is already translated in the West usually. Sometimes it's something that's not translated, but they also give an agenda, so you know what you need to translate and how you need to translate it and what it needs to convey, what it needs to hide also at the same time. But the problem with translating from Chinese, he said, is that you have to translate not the language, but you have to translate the culture. And at the moment when the Communist Party gives me the assignment to translate, I have to translate the Communist Party culture. But at the moment when I would translate myself, I would try to translate the Daoist culture. And there's not always opportunity for that. And he says the problem with Western translators is that they translate only the Western culture towards the Western culture. And they use the Chinese as an excuse.
And that was really shocking.
Because I never really saw it like that before. I already was on the track with understanding that there are cultural changes which are really enormously significant that happened both in the East and in the West in the last, say, 500 years. These are big cultural changes that changed perspectives on a lot of things. Or for China, it's obvious because of the westernization and the conquest by the Qing started that cultural revolution already. In the West, it was largely Immanuel Kant, but also the cynicism of somebody like Nietzsche and the existentialism of Sartre, which gave us a grip on reality which was very different from anything that came before. And now, in essence, as a European, it's very hard to understand anything that was written in the Middle Ages. We can read the words, but what they were actually intending to mean, we can only guess. So we have limited ourselves because of our cultural changes. Now, the Middle Ages is a different culture. When looking at the Chinese language, and you want to translate this, you are talking about translating culture. Taoism is a culture. It's a science, it's a culture, and a culture and a science, as far as I'm concerned, as a result of that, are basically the same. So when you speak a particular language, you speak the scientific language of that culture. You're expressing that culture. And that culture tells you what to think, what to feel, and what to act like, and where you should feel shame or guilt or feel frustrated or have to be judged by other people because of what you do. In most cultures, you try to avoid to be judged by other people. And it's in our cultures no different than from the Chinese, although our punishments might be a little bit more different than their punishments within their social circles. Having lived for 15 years in China with Taoists, with non-Taoists also, having worked with people from different parts of Chinese society, spoken with business people, governors, mayors, police people, Taoist masters, Qigong masters, Tai Chi masters, Chinese medicine masters, massage masters, and herbal masters, just to name a few. I came to the discovery that the pride that the Chinese have about their culture makes them think that we cannot understand them. they think they understand us because they have this universalist view about us. And it is indeed very difficult for Westerners to understand the Chinese things. So maybe they are right to a degree. It's not impossible, but it takes a lot of work. When I was having first people from Australia living with me in my house, long time ago, they were having the same thing. They said, like, look, we understand from the perspective of our culture that you Europeans, you behave like children. So we treat you like children. Because they functioned within their cultural framework. When I was talking with medicine people from Native American tribes in New Mexico, Canada, even from South America, also their idea is all the time the immaturity of our culture. Whether their judgment is right or not right, it is just that we don't fit within their culture. This is basically their sense of immaturity is like that. So we can consider ourselves very, very mature, but not immature. When I started translating, I started first translating with the I Ching, Tao Te Ching. When I came with the Tao Te Ching to Master Zhang, female abbot in Qingshan Mountains, my Kung Fu sister, my Daoist sister, Chen Li Fang, she told her about this. I wasn't going to tell this, being shy and a little bit, embarrassed about the fact that I even tried to translate it. She started laughing. And she's like, oh, how can you ever translate the Tao Te Ching? Chinese is already difficult for a foreigner, but the Tao Te Ching is even for Chinese is almost impossible to understand. Most people, most Taoists, they study their whole life on the Tao Te Ching. And then if they, at the end of their life, they understand one character or one sentence or one verse, then they're already very accomplished. So how do you think you can translate the Tao Te Ching? And in my bookshelves and in my boxes, I have many different translations. And it is true. I mean, if you look at all these translations, they all seem to have a sense of truth in them because they're all very similar. There's small changes in interpretation of words or word order or the way how words are being bent and stuff like this. But in reality, a lot of translations still go back to the 19th century introduction of these texts in the West. And most translators, they basically look at the old translation and then they try to make their version of it. It is just a new kind of car with a little bit changed shape of spoiler. It doesn't mean that these people are not, righteous in their way of translating. It just means that the limitation of our culture makes that people do not really go really to translate things very well. And I'm pointing here especially to translation, which is a very thick translation with all kind of historical facts and stuff like this. The book was amazing, but the translation itself, you could really read in the translation from Richard Kunst that he mostly translated from his head. Like, this is what the Chinese character mean, like how you would read a newspaper. He was so much in trust of what he was saying, in what he understood about the Chinese language, that he passed by on some of the intrinsic difficulties of the Chinese. And although his translation was very helpful for me, when I started looking deeper into it, because of realizing like there's something off with the translation, I come to realize like there's so many other interpretations possible. Not all interpretations might be true, but what is then the difference? And after talking with my friend, the translator, in the train, also called Zhang, by the way, I come to realize that the culturation was missing. So the specific Chineseness and the specific Taoist perspective was missing in the Tao Te Ching. So it doesn't matter which framework of text you use, but if that culturalization is missing, that is a very big thing. I see the same thing happening in still modern translations of all kind of things, from prayer books to other things. There are some exceptions of people who think really very deep about Taoism and about Chinese culture and so on. I don't want to generalize too much. There are people that I can really deep within me. I can feel like these people, they really reach somewhere and they are on the right track. They really invested themselves into their work. what you have seen in the video is some of the translation work that I have been going through. That is just some of the texts which are based on these enculturations. And for this text, I have made an app that you can sign up for. You can read all these things, and you can follow me, and you can proofread for me when I am every time producing new parts of this translation work. I'm now halfway with the translation of the text of Zhang Sanfen. I think before the summer I might be able to finish that. So there will be the first full text. There's all other texts that are in there that I'm still working at. There are some texts that are not even in there, and there are some texts that I've lost over time. And I'm really annoyed about that, because some of them I was very happy about it because they taught me a lot. And this translation work teaches me also a lot about Taoism. And I can see how easy it is to make errors in a translation. And I think as a Taoist, as a practitioner of Chinese medicine, Taoist medicine, as a practitioner of Tai Chi Chuan, I have gained a lot of understanding from that. And I want to benefit you for that. So if you are doing anything in this field or you're interested, don't hesitate to sign up. Thank you very much.